At 25,000 feet, the air is so thin it feels like death is already waiting. Now imagine losing the entire front of your aircraft at that altitude. No glass, no metal, no protection. Just raw wind screaming into the cockpit at nearly 300 miles per hour, tearing oxygen masks away, ripping flesh-numb, freezing breath in your lungs before it leaves your mouth. This B-17 flying fortress should have broken apart instantly. It didn't. For 10 minutes, the crew didn't fly using controls. They flew by pulling bare steel cables with their hands, while exposed to open sky, enemy fire, and temperatures that could kill a man in seconds. This is not a legend. This is not exaggeration. This actually happened. And what those men endured inside that torn-open bomber is one of the most terrifying survival moments in World War II aviation history. The mission was routine by wartime standards. A daylight bombing run deep into enemy territory. Engines humming in formation. Aluminum wings catching pale sunlight above a sea of clouds. Inside the B-17, everything smelled of oil, metal, and tension. No one relaxed. They never did, because every man on board knew the truth. The flying fortress was strong, but not invincible. German flak erupted without warning. Black bursts punched the sky, shaking the bomber like a living thing under attack. The aircraft shuddered violently as fragments slammed into the fuselage, rattling bones and teeth. Then came the hit that changed everything. A direct explosion tore through the nose section. Not cracked, not damaged. Gone. The entire front of the aircraft vanished in an instant. Plexiglass, metal frame, instruments, gun mount ripped away like paper. The wind exploded inside the plane. Air pressure collapsed. Sound vanished, replaced by a violent, endless roar. Loose objects were sucked outward immediately. Maps, gear, fragments of insulation disappeared into open sky. The bombardier was gone, ripped from his position before anyone could react. The navigator slammed backward, barely holding on to structure as freezing air burned his lungs. Oxygen lines snapped. Masks tore free. Breath turned into pain. The temperature dropped below zero instantly. Skin went numb. Fingers lost feeling within seconds. The cockpit was no longer inside an aircraft. It was outside. Ice formed on exposed metal. Eyes watered uncontrollably. Every inhale felt like inhaling shards of glass. The pilot tried the controls. Nothing responded. The blast had severed the control linkages. The B-17 began to dip, slowly at first, then steeper. A heavy bomber entering a dive at altitude doesn't glide. It falls. The co-pilot screamed something no one could hear. Communication headsets were useless now. Sound couldn't travel normally in that chaos of rushing air. One of the engineers realized the truth before anyone else. The control cables were still there. Exposed, whipping violently in the wind. The only way to steer the aircraft was by grabbing them by hand. No gloves thick enough. No safety. No margin for error. Hands reached forward into a storm of freezing air and vibrating steel. The cables sliced into palms instantly. Blood froze as fast as it emerged. Muscles burned, then went numb. But the aircraft responded, just barely. Pull too hard, and the bomber would snap. Pull too soft, and it would dive itself apart. They had to feel the airplane. Every second mattered. 10 minutes. That's how long they needed to stabilize the aircraft. 10 minutes in open sky. 10 minutes with no nose. 10 minutes knowing one slip meant everyone would vanish into the clouds below. Enemy fighters circled at a distance, unsure what they were seeing. A B-17 with no face, still flying, still fighting gravity, still refusing to die. And inside that torn-open fuselage, men clung to steel cables with frozen hands, discovering in real time that survival sometimes comes down to raw human grip. And the worst part, the engines were still running. The plane was still moving forward, which meant the wind wasn't going to stop. Not yet. Time stopped behaving normally. Inside the shattered B-17, seconds stretched into something heavier, each one demanding effort just to survive. The wind didn't ease. It intensified, clawing through the open nose with mechanical cruelty, flattening clothing against skin, turning every movement into resistance. Hands were already failing. The men gripping the exposed control cables could no longer feel their fingers. Pain had passed into numbness, and numbness was worse. You could fight pain. You couldn't fight silence in your nerves. The aircraft shuddered again, this time not from flak, but from instability. Without the nose, the airflow was wrong. Turbulence hammered the fuselage unevenly. The B-17 yawed slightly, then corrected, then dipped again. Every correction required brute force. Men leaning back with their full weight, boots braced against twisted metal, pulling steel lines that vibrated like live wires. One slip would mean a sudden roll. A roll at this altitude would tear the wings off. Frost formed instantly on eyebrows, eyelashes, exposed skin. Speech was impossible. Lips wouldn't move properly. Words would have frozen anyway. The navigator, still alive but badly hurt, tried to crawl backward, away from the open sky. Every movement was a battle against suction, like the aircraft itself wanted to throw them out. Someone grabbed his harness and hauled him inside by inches. The radio was dead. The intercom was dead. Hand signals barely worked in the chaos. The only communication left was eye contact. Wide, focused, silent. They all understood the same thing at once. They weren't going to make it back in formation. The pilot made the decision with a single motion, breaking away. The B-17 peeled off slowly, awkwardly, like a wounded animal leaving the herd. The other bombers couldn't help. To slow down would mean death for them too. German fighters noticed. They always did. Two silhouettes detached from the distant clouds and began closing in cautiously. Even from a distance, the damage was obvious. No nose, no forward guns. Just raw structure and a screaming void where the cockpit should have been. An easy kill, except something didn't make sense. The bomber wasn't spiraling. It wasn't losing altitude rapidly. It was still under control, barely, impossibly. The gunners in the rear watched the fighters approach, helpless to warn the front. Their fingers hovered near triggers, knowing the forward defenses were gone. Inside the cockpit, strength began to fade. Muscles cramped. Shoulders burned. Blood loss from split hands mixed with ice, numbing grip even further. Every pull on the cables became weaker than the last. One man's grip slipped. Just for a fraction of a second, the aircraft lurched violently to one side. Loose equipment slammed into walls. A sudden drop stole breath from every chest. He recovered, but the message was clear. They were running out of time. Altitude was bleeding away. Cold was winning, and the fighters were almost in range. The pilot leaned forward into the wind, face raw, eyes tearing, and made a single choice, one that would decide whether they lived or died. He ordered the descent, not a controlled glide. A calculated fall. They would trade altitude for air density, warmth for survivability, stability for a chance to land. The men on the cables pulled again, harder than before, forcing the wounded bomber downward. The sky darkened as they dropped through layers of cloud. Ice loosened slightly. Fingers tingled painfully as circulation tried to return. Pain returned too. That meant they were still alive. The German fighters hesitated. Something about the bomber felt wrong, unnatural. A machine that should have already disintegrated was still flying, still refusing to obey expectations. They broke off, not out of mercy, out of uncertainty. And uncertainty, in war, is sometimes enough. The B-17 plunged toward lower altitude, shaking violently, screaming in the wind, every man aboard knowing that surviving the sky didn't mean surviving what came next. Because landing a bomber with no nose might be more dangerous than staying airborne, and they had only minutes left to find out. As the altitude dropped, the cold loosened its grip, but replaced it with something just as dangerous. Air. Thicker air meant resistance. Resistance meant stress. The B-17 began to shake in a new way. Not the sharp violence of flak, but a deep structural groan, like metal protesting its own survival. With the nose gone, airflow slammed directly into the cockpit frame, creating turbulence the aircraft was never designed to handle. Panels rattled. Rivets screamed. The whole front section flexed like it might tear free. The men holding the cables felt every movement amplified through their arms. Each vibration traveled straight into bone. The control cables were not meant to be handled like this. They were supposed to run smoothly through pulleys, insulated, balanced. Now they whipped and shuddered with every change in speed, biting into skin that had already split and frozen. One wrong pull could overstress the elevator. One hesitation could send the bomber nose down. They couldn't afford either. The pilot tried to read what remained of the instruments. Half were gone. The rest were rimed with ice and vibration. He relied on instinct, pressure in the controls, angle of the horizon, the sound of engines fighting drag they were never meant to face. The navigator lost consciousness. There was no way to secure him properly. The open nose meant constant suction. Two men took turns anchoring his body, their own harnesses stretched tight, boots jammed against twisted framing to keep all three from being dragged forward. They couldn't look down. Below them, through the open front, the world rushed past in terrifying clarity. Clouds tearing by, then land, green and brown and impossibly far away. No glass, no buffer, just sky. The descent stabilized briefly, then began to oscillate. Up, down, yawing slightly left. The aircraft felt drunk, wounded, unpredictable. The pilot signaled again, "Prepare for landing." That word carried no comfort, because no one aboard had ever landed a B-17 like this. There were no manuals, no training films, no precedent anyone could recall. Landing gear deployment would be critical. Too early, and drag could tear the plane apart. Too late, and they'd overshoot or slam in too fast. The engineer moved aft, crawling inch by inch, checking systems while bracing against the wind. His movements were slow and deliberate, not because he lacked urgency, but because rushing meant being ripped from the aircraft. The cables slackened for a moment as the men repositioned. The plane dipped again. Every heart stopped. They pulled hard, together, muscles screaming, tendons protesting. The bomber responded, leveling just enough to avoid catastrophe. Sweat mixed with ice. Blood smeared across steel. This wasn't flying anymore. It was wrestling gravity with bare hands. The airfield finally appeared, a long strip of earth far below, almost unreal. Smoke drifted from distant impacts. Vehicles scattered as ground crews noticed the approaching shape. Some pointed, some ran. They were seeing something no one expected to land. A B-17 with no face, descending under manual tension held together by human strength and stubbornness. The approach was wrong. Too steep. Too fast. There would be no second chance. The pilot adjusted power, carefully, afraid to stress the airframe further. The engines roared unevenly, fighting the torn aerodynamics. The runway rushed closer. Wind howled louder than ever as the aircraft lined up, nose wide open, sky pouring in. And in those final seconds, as the ground rose to meet them, every man aboard understood the same brutal truth. If the cables slipped now, if hands failed now, there would be no explosion, just impact. And silence. The ground came up fast, too fast. With no nose, depth perception was wrong, twisted by wind, by vibration, by terror. The pilot judged the descent by instinct alone, watching the edge of the runway climb through open sky, as if the earth itself were rushing to kill them. The men on the cables were past pain now. Their hands were raw meat inside frozen gloves. Muscles trembled uncontrollably. Every correction took longer. Every pull felt weaker than the last. The landing gear dropped. The sudden drag hit the aircraft like a fist. The B-17 lurched violently forward, the open cockpit flooded with even more air, ripping at bodies and straps. One man nearly lost his grip completely, saved only because another wrapped an arm around his waist and anchored him with sheer desperation. The plane dipped again. This time, there was no room to recover. The pilot cut power, not gently, hard. The engine screamed, then throttled back as the bomber slammed onto the runway, wheels striking unevenly, bouncing once, twice, the entire airframe shuddering as if it would snap in half. Metal shrieked. Sparks erupted from the landing gear as one wheel skidded sideways. The aircraft veered, nearly ground looping, then straightened just enough to stay on the strip. Inside, men were thrown forward violently, harnesses biting into flesh. One hit his head hard enough to see stars, then darkness, then reality again as the bomber slammed down a second time. The third impact was the worst. The open nose dug into turbulent air just feet above the ground, creating lift where none should exist, forcing the tail down violently. The rear gunner was thrown against his station, ribs cracking audibly, but the aircraft stayed together. Barely. The B-17 rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust, smoke, and torn earth. Engines coughing, metal ticking as it cooled. Silence creeping back in for the first time since the hit. For several seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. They were waiting for the explosion that never came. Then, hands released the cables. Fingers wouldn't straighten. Arms wouldn't lift. Men collapsed where they stood, bodies shaking uncontrollably as adrenaline drained away. Blood dripped slowly from palms onto the floor, thawing now, warm again, real again. Ground crews reached the aircraft cautiously. They stopped dead when they saw it, a flying fortress with its entire nose missing. Controls destroyed. Structure exposed. Blood and ice everywhere. Someone whispered, "How did this thing even fly?" Inside, the crew didn't answer. They couldn't. They were still alive, but only just beginning to understand how close they had come to dying in the open sky, pulling on bare steel cables while the world tried to tear them apart. And for every man aboard, one thought settled in permanently. The enemy hadn't nearly killed them. The air had. And it almost finished the job. The medics reached the aircraft in silence. No cheers, no shouting, just disbelief. They climbed into the fuselage and stopped when they saw the cockpit. There was no glass to step around, no door frame, only open air where the nose should have been. The sky stared back at them, calm now, almost mocking. The crew looked less like survivors and more like men dragged out of a storm. Hands were swollen beyond recognition. Skin had split open in deep, jagged lines where steel cables had cut through flesh. Some fingers were already turning dark, early signs of frostbite that would decide their fate hours later. Two men couldn't release their grip fully. Their hands had cramped into clawed shapes, muscles locked by cold and shock. Medics had to pry fingers away gently, one by one. The navigator was carried out on a stretcher, barely breathing. The bombardier was never found. In the hours that followed, word spread across the base. not as an official report, but as whispers moving faster than paperwork. A B-17 landed with no nose. They flew it by hand. They were exposed to open sky. Pilots who had flown dozens of missions stood staring at the wreckage, pale and quiet. These were men who had faced flak walls and fighter swarms without blinking. This shook them because it violated an unspoken rule of aviation. Aircraft fail in predictable ways. Human bodies do not belong outside at altitude, and yet these men had endured 10 full minutes where survival should not have been possible. An investigation followed. Engineers examined the damage, tracing where control lines had snapped, where structure had failed. Their notes were careful, technical, emotionally detached. But even they struggled to explain one thing: the aircraft should have broken apart. The aerodynamic stress alone, combined with sudden pressure loss, should have torn the fuselage open further. The only reason it hadn't was constant micro-correction, continuous human adjustment that no automatic system could have replicated. One engineer wrote a single line in the margin of his report: "Human input compensated for structural loss." That sentence would later be removed. The crew was grounded permanently. Some would never fly again, not because of physical injury, but because sleep refused to come without wind screaming in their ears. One man couldn't stand near open doors. Another refused to fly above clouds ever again. The war moved on. There were more missions, more bombers lost, more crews who never came back at all. But among airmen, this story lingered. Not as inspiration, as warning, because if the sky could do that to a machine built for war, it could do it to anyone. No medals were pinned in a public ceremony. No headlines ran in newspapers. The official war record reduced the incident to a technical note buried inside mission logs, listed as severe structural damage, aircraft recovered. Nothing more. That silence was deliberate, because what happened inside that B-17 created a problem no one in command wanted discussed. If men could survive something that should have killed them instantly, then every crew that didn't survive suddenly raised questions no one could answer. So the story stayed unofficial. But it did not disappear. Quiet changes followed. Emergency training manuals were revised without explanation. Pilots were drilled harder on manual control redundancy. Crews were taught to memorize cable routing inside the aircraft, something previously left only to engineers. Most importantly, bomber crews were trained for something that had never been acknowledged before: flying without protection. Flying with nothing between them and death but muscle memory. Psychologists, though they weren't called that yet, interviewed the surviving crew. Not about heroism. About fear. Every man described the same moment. The moment the cold arrived. The moment sound disappeared. The moment the sky felt close enough to touch. They all said the same thing in different words. The plane stopped feeling like a machine. It felt like a wounded animal, and we were holding it together. One officer wrote privately that the incident changed how he viewed air combat forever. From that day forward, he said, "I no longer trusted altitude. I trusted people." The aircraft itself was dismantled quietly. Its remains were scrapped, melted down, repurposed into materials for other bombers. Aircraft that would never know what parts of them had once been ripped open and still flown home. The crew was reassigned to ground duty. They lived, which, in war, was unusual enough to be uncomfortable. Years later, one survivor was asked during a reunion why he never talked about that flight. He paused for a long time. Then he answered, "Because if you talk about it too much, you start wondering why you lived when so many better men didn't." The B-17 that lost its entire nose did not change the outcome of the war. It didn't win a battle. It didn't shift strategy, but it revealed something terrifyingly important: that even in machines built for mass destruction, survival still depended on fragile hands gripping bare cables, refusing to let go. And sometimes, for 10 unbearable minutes, that was enough. Dark War Records.